January 17th, 1944. The waters off the Marshall Islands. The ocean is black and restless. 300 feet below the surface, Commander Takeo Yamada sits in near-total darkness inside the cramped control room of the I-175, a Japanese Type B submarine. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and the metallic tang of recycled breath. His men are silent, their faces pale in the dim red glow of the instrument panels. They have been submerged for 14 hours. The batteries are dying. The oxygen is thin. But they wait. They must wait. Above them, somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific, the enemy hunts. Yamada places his hand on the cold steel bulkhead, as if feeling for the heartbeat of his vessel. He closes his eyes and listens. The submarine groans softly, the way old ships do when the pressure of the deep tries to crush them. For a moment, there is nothing. Just the hum of the electric motors, the quiet breathing of his crew. Then faintly, a sound, a soft, rhythmic pinging. Distant, mechanical, unnatural. It is not the sonar of a destroyer. It is something else, something new, something they have never heard before. His executive officer looks at him, eyes wide with confusion. "What is that, Commander?" Yamada does not answer. He does not know. But deep in his gut, beneath the layers of training and discipline, he feels it. A cold, creeping dread. The sound grows louder, closer. It is as if the ocean itself has learned to see. Above the surface, a small cylinder bobs in the waves. It is no larger than a trash can, painted dull gray, unremarkable in every way. It has no crew, no engine, no weapons. But inside its steel shell, a battery-powered hydrophone listens. It listens with a patience no human sonar operator could ever match. It listens and it transmits. And 2 miles away, aboard the destroyer escort USS England, a young radioman named Robert Haynes sits with headphones pressed to his ears, staring at an oscilloscope screen. A bright green blip pulses in the darkness. "Contact," he says quietly. "Bearing 270, range 1,200 yards. The captain does not hesitate. "Bring us around. Prepare depth charges. This is the moment. This is the instant when the vast, silent Pacific, once the domain of the Japanese submarine fleet, becomes a trap. This is the moment when technology, American ingenuity, and the sheer industrial power of a nation at war converge into something the Japanese Navy has no answer for. This is the moment Japan begins to lose control of the sea. In the spring of 1942, the Pacific Ocean belonged to Japan. After the devastating strike on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy swept across the western Pacific with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Philippines fell. British Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all collapsed under the weight of Japan's military machine. For 6 months, it seemed as though nothing could stop them. Their submarine fleet, though smaller than Germany's U-boat force, operated with impunity, ranging as far east as the coast of California, sinking merchant ships, shelling coastal towns, even launching float planes to drop incendiary bombs on the forests of Oregon. The American West Coast lived in fear. Blackout curtains went up in San Francisco. School children practiced air raid drills in Los Angeles. The ocean, once a symbol of security, had become a highway for the enemy. But by 1943, the tide had begun to shift. The victories at Midway and Guadalcanal had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. American shipyards, operating at a scale the world had never seen, churned out destroyers, carriers, and escort vessels at a rate that defied comprehension. In 1941, the U.S. Navy commissioned 11 destroyers. In 1943, they commissioned 128. The assembly lines at Kaiser Shipbuilding in Richmond, California, could complete a Liberty ship in 4 days. 4 days. It was a pace of production so absurd, so overwhelming, that even American naval planners had trouble believing their own reports. But it was real, and it was only the beginning. What the Japanese did not yet understand, what they could not understand, was that the Americans were not just building more ships. They were building smarter ships. Ships equipped with technologies that turned the ocean into a grid of invisible eyes and ears. Among these technologies, one device in particular would prove catastrophic for Japan's submarine force: the sonobuoy. The sonobuoy was born out of desperation. In the early years of the war, American anti-submarine warfare was primitive, almost medieval in its inefficiency. Surface ships relied on active sonar, which required them to be within a few thousand yards of a submerged enemy. Aircraft could spot surfaced submarines, but once a sub dove, it became invisible. Submarines were ghosts, and hunting them was a matter of luck as much as skill. The U.S. Navy needed a way to extend the reach of its listening devices, to scatter sensors across vast stretches of ocean, to turn the hunting of submarines from a needle-in-a-haystack gamble into a methodical, relentless pursuit. The solution came from the Columbia University Division of War Research, a group of physicists and engineers working in secret laboratories in New York. In 1942, they developed the first functional sonobuoy, a self-contained, expendable acoustic sensor that could be dropped from aircraft, float on the surface, and transmit underwater sounds back to the plane via radio. The early models were crude. They had a battery life of only 30 minutes. Their radio range was limited, but they worked. And by 1943, improved versions, designated ANCRT-1, were being mass-produced by the thousands. These buoys could operate for up to 3 hours. They could be dropped in patterns, creating vast sonar nets that covered hundreds of square miles. And most importantly, they were cheap. So cheap that they could be used recklessly, scattered across the ocean like seeds. For the Japanese submarine fleet, the sonobuoy was an invisible apocalypse. Commander Yamada had been at sea for 19 years. He had served in the Second Sino-Japanese War. He had patrolled the waters off Manchuria, the coast of China, the South Pacific. He knew the sea the way a hunter knows the forest. He knew when to move and when to be still. He knew how to read the currents, the temperature layers, the thermoclines that could hide a submarine from enemy sonar. He had survived depth charge attacks before. He had evaded destroyers, slipped past convoy escorts, sunk enemy transports. He was a veteran, a professional. But this was different. The pinging continues. It does not fade. It does not move away. It simply persists, tracking him with a precision that seems impossible. Yamada orders the submarine to change course, to dive deeper, to cut speed to a crawl. But the sound follows. No matter what he does, it follows. His executive officer checks the charts, recalculates their position, suggests a new heading. Yamada nods, though he knows it will not matter. Whatever is hunting them is not guessing. It is not sweeping randomly. It is locked onto them, and it will not let go. In the forward torpedo room, the crew sits in silence. Some of them are teenagers, boys barely old enough to shave, plucked from fishing villages and farm towns and trained in the brutal efficiency of the Imperial Navy. They do not speak. They do not joke. They simply wait, their hands gripping the rails, their eyes fixed on the ceiling as if they could see through the steel hull to the surface above. One of them, a boy named Kenji, clutches a small photograph of his mother. He does not pray. He was raised Shinto, taught that death in service to the emperor is the highest honor. But in this moment, alone in the dark, he feels only fear. Above, the USS England closes in. The sonobuoy data is relayed in real time to the ship's anti-submarine warfare team, a group of young men, most of them in their early 20s, who have been trained to read the electronic signatures of enemy submarines the way a doctor reads an X-ray. They know the I-175's speed, depth, and heading. They know it is trying to evade. They know it will fail. The captain orders a spread of depth charges, set to detonate at 300 feet. The charges roll off the stern, splashing into the water like stones. For a moment, there is silence. Then the ocean erupts. The first explosion hits the I-175 amidships. The blast is not a sound. It is a physical force, a hammer of compressed water that slams into the hull with enough violence to rupture steel. The lights go out. Men are thrown from their stations. In the engine room, a pipe bursts, spraying scalding steam. In the control room, Yamada is knocked to his knees. His ears are ringing. He cannot hear his men screaming, but he can see their mouths open, their faces twisted in agony. The submarine lurches violently, listing to port. Alarms shriek. Water begins to pour in through a dozen hairline fractures. The chief engineer is shouting something, but Yamada cannot make out the words. It does not matter. He knows what is happening. They are dying. He pulls himself to his feet, grabs the intercom, and gives the order to surface. But the ballast system is damaged. The compressed air tanks are ruptured. The submarine is too heavy, taking on water too fast. They are sinking. The second explosion finishes it. The hull cracks open like an eggshell. The ocean rushes in with a roar that drowns out everything. In the forward torpedo room, Kenji does not have time to scream. The water takes him in an instant, cold and absolute. The I-175 plunges into the abyss, carrying 73 men with it. On the surface, the crew of the England watches the oil slick spread across the water. There is no cheering, no celebration, just a quiet confirmation. One more enemy submarine destroyed, one more entry in the logbook. The sonobuoy, still floating nearby, continues to transmit for another 2 hours before its battery dies and it sinks. The Japanese had expected a traditional war, a war of honor, of decisive battles, of samurai spirit against industrial might. They had studied the great naval conflicts of history, Trafalgar, Tsushima, Jutland, and they believed that victory in the Pacific would be determined by the clash of battleships and carriers, by the courage of their pilots, and the skill of their admirals. They were not wrong. Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. These were the battles that broke the spine of the Japanese fleet. But beneath the surface, in the dark and silent depths, another war was being waged. A war of technology and attrition. A war the Japanese were losing before they even understood it had begun. The sonobuoy was not the only weapon in America's anti-submarine arsenal, but it was perhaps the most insidious. It required no courage to deploy. It demanded no sacrifice. It was simply dropped by the hundreds, by the thousands, transforming entire swaths of ocean into invisible kill zones. Japanese submarine captains, trained in the old doctrines of stealth and patience, found themselves hunted by an enemy they could not see, could not fight, could not escape. The statistics are brutal. In 1942, the U.S. Navy sank 19 Japanese submarines. In 1943, that number rose to 23. But in 1944, the year the sonobuoy became standard equipment on nearly every American anti-submarine aircraft, the number jumped to 55. By the end of the war, Japan had lost 130 submarines, more than 80% of its entire undersea fleet. The survival rate for Japanese submariners was among the lowest of any military branch in any nation during the war. Lower than Luftwaffe bomber crews, lower than Soviet penal battalions. To serve on a Japanese submarine after 1943 was, statistically, a death sentence, and yet they continued to fight. Orders from Tokyo continued to be issued. New submarines, fewer and fewer as the months wore on, continued to be launched. Crews continued to volunteer, knowing the odds, because that was what was expected. The Imperial Navy did not speak of surrender. It did not acknowledge defeat. It simply sent men into the ocean, again and again, until there were no more men to send. Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka was 24 years old when he boarded the I-58 in April of 1945. The war was nearly over. though no one dared say it aloud. Okinawa was falling. The skies over Japan were filled with B-29s. The cities were burning. But the Navy still had orders. The I-58 was to patrol the waters east of the Philippines, to hunt American supply convoys, to disrupt the enemy's advance. It was a suicide mission, and everyone aboard knew it. Tanaka was a sonar operator, one of the best in the fleet. He had been trained at the Naval Academy in Yokosuka, had studied the acoustic signatures of every Allied warship, had learned to distinguish the sound of a destroyer's propeller from that of a cruiser by the pitch of its screws alone. He was proud of his skill. He believed it gave him a chance, however small, of survival. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what he encountered in those final months. The first time he heard it, he thought it was a malfunction, a strange, pulsing echo that did not match any known sonar profile. It was too regular, too mechanical. He reported it to the captain, who ordered the submarine to dive deeper and change course. But the sound followed. They changed course again. It followed. They cut their engines, drifted silently for 2 hours. Still, it followed. Tanaka sat in the sonar room, headphones clamped over his ears, listening to that cold, relentless pinging. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that they were already dead. They just did not know it yet. The I-58 survived that encounter. By luck, or perhaps because the American aircraft that had dropped the sonobuoy was called away to another contact, the submarine escaped. But Tanaka never forgot the sound. It haunted him. In his bunk, in the mess hall, even during the brief moments of rest, he could still hear it. That steady, mechanical heartbeat. The sound of the ocean learning to see. 3 weeks later, the I-58 torpedoed the USS Indianapolis, sinking the heavy cruiser in 12 minutes and killing over 800 American sailors. It was one of the last significant Japanese submarine victories of the war. But the triumph was hollow. The Indianapolis had already completed its secret mission, delivering components of the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. And the I-58 itself would survive the war only by surrendering in August of 1945, its crew taken prisoner, its captain interrogated by American intelligence, officers who were far more interested in the submarine's technology than in any notion of honor or glory. Tanaka spent 2 years in a POW camp in Guam. He was repatriated to Japan in 1947, returned to a country that no longer existed. The cities he had known were ash. The empire was gone. The Navy was disbanded. He found work as a fisherman, operating a small boat out of a coastal village in Shikoku. He never spoke of the war, not to his wife, not to his children, but sometimes, late at night, when the sea was calm and the only sound was the lapping of waves against the hull, he would stop what he was doing and listen, listening for that sound, that pinging, that ghost. The sonobuoy was a small thing, a canister of steel and electronics, no more remarkable than a fire hydrant. And yet, in its simplicity, it represented something larger. It was a product of a nation that approached war not as a romantic test of will, but as an engineering problem to be solved. The United States did not ask its soldiers to die with honor. It asked them to win, and it gave them the tools to do so. The sonobuoy, the proximity fuse, the Norden bomb sight, the radar-equipped night fighters, these were not weapons of courage. They were weapons of overwhelming, ruthless efficiency. They were the products of a society that valued innovation over tradition, pragmatism over glory, results over ritual. This was the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War. Japan fought with the spirit of the samurai, with the belief that willpower could overcome material disadvantage, that a single determined warrior could turn the tide of battle. And there were moments, brief, shining moments, when that belief seemed justified. The kamikaze pilots who dove into American carriers, the soldiers on Iwo Jima who fought to the last man. These were acts of extraordinary bravery, but they were also acts of desperation, because no amount of courage could change the mathematics of industrial production. No amount of willpower could counter the fact that for every Japanese submarine lost, the Americans could build 10 more destroyers. For every sonobuoy destroyed, 100 more could be manufactured. The Pacific became a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition, America's greatest weapon was not its soldiers or its ships. It was its factories. It was the ability to turn entire cities into assembly lines, to mobilize millions of workers, men and women, black and white, young and old, into a coordinated effort of staggering scale. It was the ability to look at the ocean and say, "We will fill this with sensors. We will make it impossible for the enemy to hide." And then to actually do it. By the end of 1944, American aircraft were dropping an average of 2,000 sonobuoys per month into the Pacific. 2,000 expendable, disposable sensors scattered across the sea like a fisherman's net. Each one a silent sentinel, listening, waiting. The ocean, which had once been Japan's highway, its refuge, its shield, became a prison. Submarines that had once roamed freely from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean were now confined to narrow corridors, forced to surface at night to recharge batteries, knowing that every moment on the surface was a roll of the dice. Some captains, driven mad by the constant fear of detection, refused to surface at all, staying submerged until their crews collapsed from oxygen deprivation. Others abandoned their patrols entirely, hiding in remote anchorages, waiting for orders that never came. The Japanese Admiralty knew the situation was hopeless. Internal reports from mid-1944 acknowledged that the submarine fleet had ceased to be an effective fighting force. But the orders continued, because to stop fighting, to admit defeat, would have been unthinkable. And so the submarines went out, one by one, into the dark. And one by one, they did not return. There is a recording, preserved in the U.S. National Archives, of a sonobuoy transmission from July of 1945. It is 37 minutes long. For the first 20 minutes, there is nothing but the ambient sound of the ocean. Waves, distant whale song, the faint hum of a passing storm. Then, at the 20-minute mark, a new sound appears. The low, rhythmic thrum of diesel engines, a submarine running submerged, moving slowly. The sound grows louder, closer. The submarine is heading directly toward the sonobuoy, perhaps unaware of its presence, perhaps simply out of options. For 3 minutes, the engines are clearly audible, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. And then, abruptly, the sound changes. A series of sharp, violent cracks. Depth charges. The engines sputter, cough, and die. There is a long, grinding screech, the sound of metal tearing. Then silence. Just the ocean. Just the waves. No one knows which submarine it was. There is no record of the kill, no debris recovered, no survivors. It is simply one more anonymous grave on the floor of the Pacific. One more crew that sailed into the dark and never returned. The sonobuoy transmitted for another 15 minutes. Then its battery died, and it sank. This is the legacy of the sonobuoy. Not glory, not headlines, just silent mechanical efficiency. The patient, relentless elimination of an enemy that refused to surrender. It is not a romantic story. There are no heroes in this tale, no dramatic speeches, no last stands. There is only the cold logic of industrial warfare. The understanding that in a modern conflict, victory belongs not to the bravest, but to the most resourceful. Not to those who fight with honor, but to those who fight with more. After the war, American sonobuoy technology continued to evolve. The crude, battery-powered buoys of 1943 gave way to sophisticated devices equipped with multi-channel hydrophones, satellite uplinks, and processors capable of distinguishing a submarine's acoustic signature from background noise. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy deployed networks of sonobuoys across the Atlantic and Pacific, creating invisible barriers that Soviet submarines could not cross undetected. The technology became so advanced that by the 1970s, American anti-submarine aircraft could track a submerged enemy vessel from over 100 miles away. relaying its position in real time to surface ships and attack submarines. The sonobuoy, that small, disposable cylinder, became one of the most critical components of American naval dominance. But its origins, those desperate. Experimental days of 1942 and 1943 are often forgotten. The engineers at Columbia University who invented it received little recognition. The pilots and radio men who deployed them rarely spoke of their work. It was not glamorous. It was not cinematic. It was simply necessary. And in war, necessity is often more powerful than heroism. In the waters off the Marshall Islands, 300 feet below the surface, there are still wrecks. Dozens of them. Japanese submarines, American destroyers, cargo ships, patrol boats, an underwater graveyard scattered across the Pacific floor. Divers sometimes visit these sites, descending through the blue into the darkness, shining their lights on the corroded hulls, the empty torpedo tubes, the skeletal remains of control rooms where men once sat, listening to the ocean, waiting for the sound of the enemy. One of these wrecks is the I-175. Its hull is broken, split open by the depth charges that killed it in January of 1944. The conning tower has collapsed. The forward compartments are flooded, filled with silt and the ghosts of the men who died there. But in the aft section, where the engines once thrummed, there is a small, intact space. And in that space, on a rusted shelf, there is a photograph. A young woman in a kimono, smiling. The photograph is faded, nearly dissolved by the salt water, but the image is still faintly visible. A mother, a sister, a wife, someone who waited for a man who never came home. This is the other legacy of the sonobuoy. Not just the submarines it destroyed, but the lives it erased, the families that waited in vain, the letters that were never delivered, the futures that never happened. War is often described in terms of strategy and tactics, of victories and defeats, of technological breakthroughs and turning points. But at its core, war is about absence, the empty chair at the dinner table, the name that is no longer spoken, the photograph that fades in the dark. The sonobuoy did not win the Pacific War. That victory was the result of 1,000 factors: industrial capacity, code breaking, superior aircraft, the atomic bomb. But the sonobuoy helped. It turned the ocean from a hiding place into a hunting ground. It made the invisible visible, and in doing so, it ensured that the Japanese submarine fleet, once a symbol of imperial power, became a footnote. A cautionary tale about the dangers of fighting a modern war with an ancient mindset. Commander Takeo Yamada's body was never recovered. His name is listed on a memorial in Tokyo, along with the names of tens of thousands of other Japanese sailors who died at sea. His family received a letter from the Navy, informing them that he had been killed in action, that he had died honorably in service to the Emperor. The letter did not mention the sonobuoy. It did not mention the depth charges or the cold, crushing darkness of the deep. It simply said that he was gone. But in the archives of the USS England, there is a logbook entry dated January 17, 1944. It reads, 14:30 hours. Contact bearing 270. Depth charges deployed, submarine destroyed. No survivors. The entry is written in blue ink, in neat, efficient handwriting. It is signed by the officer of the watch, a man named Lieutenant James Anderson, who would survive the war, return to Iowa, and become a schoolteacher. He never told his students about the submarines he helped sink. He never spoke of the sonobuoys or the men who died because of them. He simply taught history, year after year, until he retired in 1978. He died in 1983 at the age of 62 and was buried in a small cemetery outside Des Moines. His gravestone does not mention the war. This is how history is made. Not by grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but by small, incremental actions. A sonobuoy dropped into the ocean. A depth charge rolled off astern. A logbook entry written in blue ink. These are the moments that change the course of wars. These are the moments that determine who lives and who dies, who wins and who loses, which nations rise and which nations fall. And in the end, that is the truth the sonobuoy reveals. That modern war is not a test of character. It is a test of capacity. The capacity to innovate. The capacity to produce. The capacity to turn the tools of science into the instruments of death. The Japanese believed that spirit could overcome material. They were wrong. And the ocean, patient and indifferent, remembers.